morning, everyone, and welcome to the second day of the Capitalism Morality Seminar. I will let Dr. Walter Block come and introduce Dr. Michael Edelstein, who is our next speaker. Thank you.
Hi, it's good to be with you. I'll be speaking later on racism and sexism, but now I'm going to introduce my very good friend Michael Edelstein. He and I have known each other since the 1960s, and we're still friends, even though we're both hateful, which is an amazing thing, but true. One of the high points that I've had with Michael is that his mentor is Albert Ellis, and my mentor is Murray Rothbard. And one time, the four of us got together at Albert Ellis's office, and we sang rational songs. Maybe Michael will explain what a rational song is. Michael is the author, most famously, of this book, 3-Minute Therapy, and whenever I have any problems psychologically, or anyone around me has, I refer them to this book. He is also the editor of Stage Fright, 40 Stars Tell You How They Beat America's #1 Fear. I'm also a contributor to that book. He's also the author of Rational Drinking, How to Live Happily With or Without Alcohol, and another book, Therapy Breakthrough, Why Some Psychotherapies Work Better Than Others. He and I are also co-authors of an article, Popsicle Sticks and Homesteading Land for Nature Preserves. That's the idea that how can you homestead land that you don't really want to touch? Well, if you want to know the answer to that, read the book. He and I have a debate over free will, and he and a few authors, and me and a few authors, are debating in the journals about free will and determinism. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to my friend Michael Edelstein. I forgot to mention that Michael and I are speaking tonight at the Real Sons of Anarchy. The speeches there start at 4 o'clock, and Michael and I are on at 8 o'clock. And Michael will be speaking about inner freedom in one lesson, and I'll be speaking about Donald Trump, plus my books, Defending the Undefendable 1 and 2. It's at Yuck Yucks, 2837 Canby, which is on the corner of 12th Avenue. It costs $10. So if you don't get enough of me and Michael and 4 other libertarian speakers, come to that as well.
Thank you, Walter, for that nice introduction. As usual, when Walter introduces me, it's the highlight of my talk. I've spoken here twice before, which I've greatly enjoyed. And the questions are very good. Usually we run out of time to get all the questions, so I'll try to be brief this time. I really enjoyed the question part of the talk more than the talk itself. I've heard the talk many times. My title today is How to Avoid Psychological Depressions Over Economic Ones. How many people during the Depression of 2008 did not feel depressed? Raise your hand. Okay, we have many rational people here. Very good. Everything I'm going to discuss tonight is based on the work of Albert Ellis. Some of you are familiar with Albert Ellis. He was a great pioneering psychologist. He's written over 80 books on a specific approach to psychotherapy called Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, which spawned the various cognitive behavior therapies, which are very popular these days. I was lucky enough to have him as my therapist when I was 18, which dramatically changed my life. His approach is a very practical, present, clear-headed approach based on a few basic principles that have profound ramifications. It starts with puncturing a basic fallacy that most people believe. I think more people believe this myth than believe that we need the state to run our lives. And the myth that Freud advanced psychotherapy. Yes, Walter?
Yeah. I guess I can't.
Oh, I can stand back. Is that better?
The P's
Any difference?
The P's were...
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay, fine. It's a more prevalent myth than balanced meals are healthful. Many of you probably believe that. And the myth is that our emotions come from situations. So if I win the lottery and I'm happy, most people would say, obviously, I'm happy because I won the lottery. That's the intuitive way. But that's not how we work psychologically. Now, unfortunately, even Ludwig von Mises bought into this myth that our emotions are caused by our situations. Mises said in Notes and Recollections, "Whosoever foresees so clearly the disaster and the destruction of everything he deems of value cannot escape pessimism and psychic depression." So what he's saying here is that the destruction causes our depression. Fortunately, a famous economic expert of our acquaintance contradicted this, and he was on the right track. Rick Rule is quoted to have said, "Your biggest problem is not the state and its tyranny, but what is between your two ears." And Shakespeare built on what Rick Rule said, and he said in Hamlet, "There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so." Just as a stark example of why this is the case, or illustrating it, imagine a sporting event, and at the end of the event, one team wins, one team loses. There are people who are happy at the end of the event. There are other people who are unhappy. But they all witnessed the same situation. The event was the same. It was what was in their heads that led them to be happy about the event or unhappy about the event. To put it in Albert Ellis's famous ABC format, A stands for activating event. The situation you're in. My team won the game. B stands for your belief about it. Isn't it great my team won the event? Isn't it wonderful? And that leads to C, the consequent emotion. I'm happy about it. So the thing to remember, the bottom line here, is that B causes C, your belief about situations causes your emotions or behaviors, not the situations themselves. And that's a very powerful idea, because if it's our thinking, not the situation, that causes our feelings, we have some power to change our thinking. We may not change the situation, but we can change our thinking so we don't get ourselves disturbed about bad situations. Now, more specifically, when we feel depressed about depressions or about anything else, or even anxious or angry, what's the specific thinking that causes this? And the answer is, it's thinking in terms of demands, absolutes, magical fictional beliefs. And there are three core demands that people invent in their heads that leads to emotional disturbance. The first is a demand on oneself, and that takes the form of, because I prefer to do well and get approval, therefore I absolutely must. I have to, and if I don't, I'm no good. I'm a worthless failure. And that leads to anxiety, depression, guilt, shame, jealousy, and other unhelpful, inappropriate negative emotions. The second demand is a demand not on oneself, but rather on others. And that takes the form of, because I prefer you treat me well, you absolutely must, treat me courteously, lovingly, appropriately, reasonably, reciprocally, kindly, and if you don't, you're no good. You're a rotten person, and that leads to resentment, hostility, and anger. And the final core demand is not a demand on people, on oneself or others, but it's a demand on the impersonal conditions of one's life, and that takes the form of, because I prefer life to be fair, easy, and hassle-free, it absolutely must, it has to be, and if it's not, life is awful, and I'm going to be miserable forever. So if you're feeling depressed or anxious or angry, that's a red flag to look for your must, look for your should, look for that absolutistic kind of thinking to identify what's causing it. Don't put the responsibility on the situation, but take the responsibility yourself. The problem is between your ears, as Rick Rule is known to have said. Now, all disciplines have specific definitions of some words, and it's the same with this approach, Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy, REBT. Now, in psychology, depression means one thing, it's an emotion, but in economics, depression means something very different related to the business cycle. In computers, apple means one thing, but you wouldn't want to take a bite of your apple if you're hungry unless you're talking about food. In libertarianism, force has one definition, initiatory or defensive force, whereas in physics, it's mass times acceleration. So in rational emotive behavior therapy, when we talk about musts and shoulds, we're talking about psychopathological musts and shoulds that lead to global conclusions and disturbed emotions. Now, if you're depressed about economic situations or your financial situation, then usually you have one or more of the following demands in your head that causes your psychological depression. And I'll list a few and see if you identify with any of these. Number one, because I prefer the economy not to crash, it absolutely must not crash, it's the end of my world. 2, it's unfair that I'm an unwilling victim of Janet Yellen and Barack Obama, of their economic ignorance. Life absolutely should be fair. It's awful, terrible, and horrible that it's not. 3, because I strongly desire to continue to afford my house and car, I absolutely must. I can't stand any less. 4, I would not like to have my investments tank. Therefore, they absolutely must not. I'll be miserable forever. 5, I strongly prefer not to be at the mercy of the evil Fed because it's ruining the economy. Therefore, I ought not to be. 6, politicians absolutely should care about me, not about themselves, and never lie, cheat, or steal. Otherwise, they're 101% rotten. They deserve to roast in hell, and I've appointed myself their roaster. And number 7, the most irrational belief of all, since depressing myself is irrational, it doesn't help, it only makes me feel bad, I should not do this to myself. Life isn't worth living when I'm depressed. So you may recognize some of those beliefs in yourself, and if you do, the question is how to address that, how to change your thinking, how to eliminate your absolutistic demands. Step one is to identify what you're telling yourself. What's my must? What's my should? What's the real cause of my depression? It's not the economy tanking, it's what I'm telling myself. So admit, take full responsibility for your emotions, not for the situation, but for your emotions about the situation. Number two, dispute, question, challenge, and contradict your musts. Ask yourself, what's the evidence things must be the way I want them to be? Who says I run the universe and I must have what I want? Where is it written that because I don't like this state of affairs, it must change? And then look for the answer to that, and if you look hard, you'll normally see there's never any evidence for these psychopathological musts and shoulds. There's just evidence for preferences. So conclude instead, although I prefer that the economy not go down the drain, there's no reason it must not. It is highly disadvantageous, inconvenient, unpleasant when it does, but it's hardly the end of my world. I don't like this state of affairs, but I definitely can stand what I don't like. I've survived economic depressions in the past, and I'll survive them in the future. I don't run the universe, and I don't control the economy or the politicians. That's unfortunate, that's too bad, but it's not the end of the universe. And then most importantly, it's not the poor economy or my poor finances that are depressing me, but rather it's my unrealistic, musty thinking about it, and I can change my thinking. I can learn to unconditionally accept hassles in my finances, problems in the world, without disturbing myself about them, although I strongly prefer things didn't go this way. And then once you internalize a new perspective, then that will still lead to negative emotions, but appropriate, helpful negative emotions, not the kind that disturb you, cloud your thinking, lead to compulsive behaviors, such as very severe sadness or regret or concern or disappointment about what's going on, rather than depression and hopelessness. Now, once you recognize a better way of thinking, the issue is, how do you get it into your brain? How do you internalize it? Just recognizing it is level one, but the question is, how do you get from level one to level two? Level one is where you recognize the truth in what's going on. It's a superficial recognition. Level two is where you hold it as a deep conviction. You strongly believe it, feel it, and act on it, and live it. And the bridge from level one to level two is using the same learning process we use to learn most things, and that says learning reinforcement is the royal road to learning. The way we learn things is through practice, reinforcement, going over it again and again and again. So the more you contradict your irrational beliefs, the more you get it into your brain. And one of the ways to contradict it, and an effective way to change your perspective, is by writing it out. Write out the A, the B, the C, and then dispute it, and write down all the reasons why the musts and shoulds are false. Well, that's the heart of how not to be depressed about economic depressions, and now I'll take your questions.
Hi, I'm Michael. How do you draw the line between genuinely seeking information, like doing research on the internet, and feeding a must. Like there's lots of websites that you can, find out that the world is collapsing or that people conspire together to do this or that. Where do you draw the line between these two sides?
So I think the question is, where do you draw the line between constructive research and compulsive research on the internet? Is that it?
Right.
And what's that?
Curatorial research that's maybe feeding a must rather than really helping them.
Yeah, and that's a good question, and there are a few answers to that. One is, if your behavior, and this is a general principle, if your behavior, whatever it is, if it's doing research or surfing the internet or anything else, if it interferes with your longer term goals, and it's defeating your longer term goals because the research in this case may be taking up more time when you could be doing research, looking for a job, getting sleep, etc., then that's a red flag saying that it's compulsive or it comes from a must. Another way to determine it is if your behavior is accompanied by anxiety, depression, guilt, anger, any of those emotions, then probably it's fueled to a must to the extent that you're overdoing it. Now remember, all musts come from preferences. So you start with a preference. I prefer to find out more information about this issue, and that will fuel a more reasonable amount of research or time into the project. But when you convince yourself, because I prefer to get more information, therefore I absolutely must, I have to, that's when the same behavior becomes too much in terms of your goals and you're overdoing it. Does that answer the question? Yes?
What are some of the tools that people could use to pull themselves out of that state of mind?
Okay, what are some of the tools to pull yourself out of your musts and shoulds? And that's a good question because I only mentioned one, and that was disputing, challenging, and contradicting your musts and shoulds. But there are many others. For example, there are behavioral techniques. So often when people are depressed, they withdraw, they stop doing things they normally do, they slough off their daily activities and responsibilities. So one thing you can do to work against your musts and depression is to push yourself to keep active, push yourself to keep doing things. And it might be helpful, for example, every night to write out a schedule for the next day with times and activities, what you're going to do, and work toward that. So that's one way to work on your musts. Another way is to reinforce a better way of looking at things by either reading books, and as I mentioned, Albert Ellis has written over 80 books on the subject, or my book, 3-Minute Therapy, which in the first chapter it has basic principles that I've been presenting here and elaborates on them, gives more examples. And in the other 13 chapters, it addresses various problems caused by musts, such as anxiety, depression, anger, social phobias, procrastination, addictions, and others. Then there are YouTubes that Albert Ellis has talks of on the internet, and I have talks on the internet about rational emotive behavior therapy, so you can reinforce it that way. And you can teach it to others. I encourage my clients, once they learn these principles, and as you can see, they're fairly simple principles, they teach it to others and teach others that it's their musts and shoulds that are causing their emotional problems, and show them how their demands are false, and show them how they can challenge and contradict them. So those are some of the ways that you can work against it.
One of the biggest problems of the libertarian movement is burnout. People are members of the libertarian movement for years and years, and they see not much move in the direction of freedom and liberty, and then they just burn out. They have had enough and they stop participating in promoting liberty. How would your philosophy or psychology
Yes, that's an important question for libertarians. And the answer is, if we use the ABC model, A, the activating event, is it seems like not much is moving forward in the libertarian movement, and C is burnout. But as we know, A doesn't cause C. It's not the lack of progress that causes people to burn out, but rather it's their B, it's their must. I must see radical change in my lifetime, otherwise it's hopeless. Although I strongly prefer to make a difference in the political environment, I absolutely must. Or because no one else agrees with my approach to liberty, as they must, I might as well give up. So those are some of the musts that lead to burnout, and then the solution again is to question, challenge, and contradict those musts. It would be preferable if we saw much more gain, but there's no reason we have to. Movements often slowly percolate over years or centuries, and there's no reason the libertarian movement must be different. I can stand the slow pace, although I don't like it. So those are some ways to address burnout.
The Dalai Lama suggests that there's no utility in either anger or worry. He teaches that if something's bothering you and you can't do anything about it, there's no sense worrying about it or being angry about it. And if you can do something about it, the way to make the worry or the anger go away is to do something about it. What would you say is action as a way to take care of financial anxiety? In other words, if you're concerned about depression, figure out what you can do to better your lot and work every day to do it.
Well, I actually recommend a two-pronged attack, Rick, and that is what the Dalai Lama suggests, action, but also changing your thinking as you act, because if you keep reinforcing the same irrational thinking, then your action could help, but it probably could be much more constructive if you were more clear-headed without your depression, anxiety, and anger. So along with that, question and challenge your unrealistic thinking. A famous case that illustrates how action in itself doesn't help is the case of Helen Hayes, who was a famous 20th century actress, and there's a theater on Broadway in New York named after her, and she said, right before I go on stage, I have a panic attack. Now, even though she had much acclaim and fame and great reviews and honor in her life, she still made herself very anxious before she went on stage, probably because although she was acting, literally and figuratively, she didn't change her thinking. Another case is Robin Williams. Walter mentioned my book, Stage Fright, and in it, in the interview with Robin Williams, he was asked, do you still get anxious before a performance? And he said, oh, totally. So I would take that to mean he really hasn't changed his thinking, although he acts. So the action is very important, but there's a two-pronged approach to it normally. Also, Rick, you came in a little late, so you missed my quoting you to support my point, and it was, your biggest problem is not the state and its tyranny, but what's between your ears. And that's a very good statement of where our emotions come from, what's between your ears.
Dr. Edelstein, do you have your books available with you today?
I have 3-minute therapy with me available, yes.
Just a question too, is one of these things, like if you're anxious about something, would be like face your fears sort of be part of what you're saying here as well?
I'm sorry, I heard the face your fears part, but what was the beginning?
So if like part of your, like if you're trying to change the way you're thinking, would be like facing your fears sort of be involved in this kind of approach or whatever?
Yes, definitely, and your your fears are your emotions, but your emotions can stop you. So if you face your fears, if you do what you're afraid of, then that normally is a good behavioral approach in addition to changing your thinking that's creating your fears. Because no situation, even a dangerous situation, could cause you to feel fear. Remember, A doesn't cause C, B does, your belief. So work on changing your thinking in addition to face your fears. There's a good book about the topic called Feel Your Fear and Do It Anyway. Just because you have fear, it doesn't mean you can't do whatever you're afraid of. Now, your fear might slow you down, it might make you less effective, but it can stop you as long as you're determined to do it. Any other questions?
What you just said is related to the question I had, where our mechanism, just like the actor and actress that gets stage fright, this is their mechanism to perform well, to cope. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I tend to get very nervous before talking, and this is, I tend to get nervous looking at the economy, whatever, but it motivates me. It is the propelling force to get me to do things, just like the actress and the actor. I think it was not a negative thing, but the very last thing you mentioned about the book there, where you use those things perhaps as a motivator to act on things.
Yeah, that's a point that people bring up, that if I didn't feel anxious or if I didn't feel angry, then I wouldn't be motivated, and these feelings motivate me. Now, if you remember the structure of emotions, our fear or anxiety comes from our thinking, musts and shoulds, and our demands come from our preferences. So I believe that what's really motivating you is the preference in there. I prefer to do well rather than the must, and therefore I must. It would be awful if I didn't. So without the anxiety, without the must that causes anxiety, you'd still have a strong preference to act and do well. So I don't think it's the must that's doing it or the anxiety that's doing it. And evidence for that is there are many speakers, actors who don't feel anxious, yet they do quite well. So the question is, what's motivating them? And it's probably their strong preference to act or speak or write in the field that they're in. Your Butler?
Yeah, your presentation reminded me of a very interesting book written by Friedrich Otto titled The End of the World History. And he deals with the collective or societal implications of how we think as individuals. And a good example of that was the millennial fear that we had in 1999. The whole world was going to collapse, at least the commercial world, the computerized world. Everything was set on computers, planes were going to crash, and banks were going to crash, and everything else was going to happen. That the failure for a society to live up to these expectations was literally an end of the world for the people who experienced it. Could you respond to that?
Yes. Well, it wasn't literally the end of the world. They thought it was. And even if they killed themselves because they were so afraid, the world went on, so it still wasn't the end of the world. Yes, but people have probably a biological predisposition to catastrophize and awfulize about things, to feel fear. And maybe 1 million years ago, as our brains were being forged, it was functional. But these days it isn't. Mark Twain said, "I've had many troubles in my life, most of which never happened." So he recognized human nature and this human tendency to worry. And as when you listen to the politicians, they recognize it because much of their rhetoric is built on scaring you, and they're going to help you out of it, and commercials, advertisements are fear-based. So it certainly is a major aspect of being human. And unfortunately, people tend to exaggerate it and magnify it rather than change it and do something about it. Other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much for your kind attention.